Today we are joined by Josh Lovell, our product manager. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Josh.
Thank you for the introduction. Today, we're going to be discussing when silica doesn't cut it for flash chromatography, what can I do? As an overview of today's talk, we'll be discussing how to choose a column, including choosing a media with purpose and how to think outside the box when using silica. We'll talk about the differences between C8, C18, and C18AQ flash medias that we offer, the impact of pore size and chain length for purifications, some unique applications for C18AQ, and then talk about how we can use C18 or C8 or C18AQ for non-aqueous reverse phase purifications as well. Then we'll get back to basic purifications with talking about columns to use for basic compounds, purification of basic compounds, including the advantage of the amine columns and choosing alumina as an alternative to silica. And then finally, we'll talk about some specific tools that are unique to the CombiFlash series of products that allows us to change our solvent and specifically the baseline correction feature on the NextGen 300 that allows us to use different solvents for some of these different stationary phases and expand our purification toolbox. So we'll begin with a discussion on choosing an appropriate stationary phase. And so we'll begin by discussing our RediSep gold material and how that enables our gold silica and gold alternate medias to perform better. And the RediSep gold columns are all based on a spherical particle shape for the silica. This leads to better packed columns and increased column efficiency. This is also a decreased particle size, which increases your column efficiency as well. You can see here with an example of a normal phase separation how the RediSep gold material outperforms the traditional RediSep material because of its the RediSep has an irregular particle shape and it's a larger particle size. So what does this mean for our separation? It means we have increased resolution, so we can either increase the column loading, load more sample per run, we can run at a higher flow rate for shorter run times, or we could run a steeper gradient as well, and that would decrease our solvent use. But the RediSep gold is at the basis of all of our RediSep alternate medias. Additionally, the benefit of the RediSep gold material is it allows for easy scale up. So we can do method development on a UPLC or HPLC with matching column chemistry. We could also do a focus gradient on a flash column using a focus gradient method developed per the instructions of application note 118 or 119 that we won't discuss here. You can validate that method on a small scale flash column, and then you can optimize the gradient conditions so that we can maximize sample loading on the small column before scaling up to the large column. And if you follow application note 121, it describes how we can scale up to large columns easily or using the NextGen software. Now you're to the point where you can go ahead and repeat that separation, have reproducible results time and time again. The additional advantage of the RediSep gold material is the increased loading capacity. So this is an example on the silica columns of the solvent savings by having the gold media. So this enables us to load twice as much compound as we could on a irregular particle or larger particle size. And the benefit of this is reduces the solvent use during the purification, and ultimately it leads to faster separations as well, so you get increased throughput. These solvent savings are for normal phase, but anytime you can scale from that irregular particle size to the RediSep gold material, you're going to see 2 times the loading benefit, and you can maybe be able to downsize your alternate media column as well. And that's even more important because of the column cost for the alternate medias. Because they are reusable, they are more expensive columns. Another benefit of using the RediSep line of columns is that all of the alternate medias and the gold and silver silica columns are tagged with RFID. And what this means is that we can load the column on the system in a loaded default method, for C18 or C18 C18 or C8 columns. Maybe that would be a method starting at 5% versus 0% because you don't want to have phase collapse. But it'll load an appropriate method for the column. Additionally, it'll disable the air purge feature automatically so you don't damage a column with air purge at the end of the run. So it automatically gets disabled by using the RFID. And additionally, I think one of the neater benefits is that because these are reusable columns, the RFID tag not only is being read by the system, but you can actually write to the RFID tag, and you can actually, it'll write the information for the last time the column was used, the solvent last used on it, the number of uses it's had, and then you could take it to another system and use that column, and you'd have that same history there, so you know what the state of the column is. Additionally, obviously, you can easily scale up methods from smaller columns or to another CombiFlash system. You have the large columns that are optimized to minimize flow restrictions, so we can use those. And you can use these on any of our competitor systems as well. And then you have the column size offerings up to 8.6 kilograms, and for the C18, the C18AQ, the C8 and Amine media, and the RediSep gold and silver silica in 7 kilogram size. So here's just a quick illustration of the different stationary phases that are available for flash chromatography and their relative polarity. And so what we have here is we have our normal phase alumina and silica that are our most polar stationary phases. And then we have an amine functionalized, followed by our C8 and C18, C18AQ functionalized medias that are decreasing polarity. And so if we think about our stationary phases, when we have a polar stationary phase, you're going to get interactions between the polar groups and an affinity for polar compounds onto the silica. And so non-polar compounds would typically elute faster. And as we go to a more normal phase, and as we go towards a C18 or C18AQ, now you get an affinity for non-polar compounds on the column, where polar compounds are actually going to elute first, and you get reverse phase separation. So how can we choose a RediSep stationary phase for our unique sample? So this is a really good flow chart that looks at the characteristics of your sample, whether it's charged, is it acid sensitive, does it have acidic properties, does it have basic properties, what's the polarity of the compound? Answering these questions can guide you into a stationary phase for optimal separation. For example, if you have a charged compound, usually your reverse phase separations are going to work better or perform better, and you'd have your C18, C18AQ, or C8 stationary phases to choose from. For acid-sensitive compounds, the neutral alumina is a really great tool. If your compound has acidic properties, then you can do normal phase, you could do reverse phase, you could use the neutral alumina again, or you could, if it has basic properties, then you can go ahead and use the basic alumina or the amine columns as well. If you look at the polarity of the compound, higher polarity compounds tend to use reverse phase C18, C18AQ purifications, or potentially maybe you're going to use like a Hillock-like separations on a bare silica. And then lower medium polarity, then you have an expanded toolbox between reverse phase or normal phase separations. And just keep in mind the highlighted gold columns are high performance columns with smaller spherical media and allow for increased loading. So column care is really important when we're using our RediSep reusable columns. They can be used over 20 times or more with proper care and sample preparation. And so we'll talk about some general guidelines here, but it's important to read the specific column instructions provided with each column. And so each column is shipped dry, so you're going to need to do an initial wash, preconditioning step, and then equilibration. And so if you're using a C18, C18AQ, or C8 column, in general, you want to wash that with 6 CVs of 1:1 water acetonitrile. And what this does is it helps the C18 or C8 or C18AQ, helps the ligands extend essentially so that they're not, and increase access to the surface of the silica in the C18, so you can get interaction and retention. For the amine column, you'd wash that with 2 to 3 CVs of methanol. And then you would want to equilibrate either of those columns before each run with your starting initial conditions. The next thing that's really important is sample preparation. We want to ensure that our sample is free of particulate and well soluble in the loading solvent. We don't want any sample or particulates to accumulate at the front of the column. This will damage the column and limit the lifetime. Additionally, you may want to use a solid load cartridge, and this can act as a guard column essentially. You could do liquid loading onto it, or you could do solid loading onto it, and it acts as a guard column. Finally, you want to ensure that you have good post-run care so that we're washing the column at the end with a high % organic solvent with 2 to 4 CVs of a high percentage organic solvent, 100% organic solvent. You know, for this would be methanol or acetonitrile, or maybe even a different solvent that offers different solubility characteristics to make sure that any impurities don't accumulate on the column. And then finally, storage is important. You never want to dry out these columns. That's the key. That's the importance of these RFID tags on the RediSep columns, is it prevents you from doing an air purge to a column and then damaging it. You want to store them wet and well capped in 10 to 80% water and 20 to 90% organic solvent. And you want to flush with 3 to 5 CVs of the storage solvent. Ensure that the immiscible solvent is used to store it, and do not store your columns under basic, acidic, or buffered conditions. So before we get into the alternate phases, I just want to throw out some ideas on how to use silica in some non-traditional ways outside of normal phase separations. So one of the alternate ways that we can use silica is with highly polar solvents. And so this is called hydrophobic interaction liquid chromatography, also commonly known as HILIC separation. And so in this example, we have a purification on a C18 column on the left. This is with caffeine and adenine. And you can see that both compounds are essentially unretained on C18 using a 10 to 100% acetonitrile and water gradient. We don't get separation between the two compounds. However, if we move to silica and actually do a HILIC separation, in which case we're actually increasing the water percentage of water and acetonitrile during the run, we actually get really good resolution between the two compounds. And so in this case, we ran a gradient of 1 to 30% water in acetonitrile on the silica. And so some things to note is that you can only use neutral or acidic modifiers as silica is soluble under basic conditions in water and methanol. So we need to keep it below pH 8. You can also run it in HILIC-like mode on an amine column as well. You want to consider starting the method at 1% water in order to hydrate the column or the silica appropriately. And just keep in mind, you need to use a solvent that's miscible with water. So this could be like an acetone, acetonitrile, IPA, ethanol, methanol, or THF. And so there's numerous solvents you can choose from. Here's another example of a HILIC separation, and this is in the purification of vitamins. In this case, the separation runs from 2 to 50% water in acetonitrile, and you can see we get really good separation in these different nitrogen heterocycles. And we also know HILIC is also referred to as aqueous normal phase. If you think about it, we're going from a non-polar to more polar solvent. We're working from an organic solvent to water, which is going to be more polar, so increasing polarity. This can be very useful for very polar compounds. And anytime you don't see retention on C18 with polar compounds, this may be a good alternative for you. So now we're going to move into our alternative medias. Specifically, we're going to focus on C8 and C18 and the differences in choosing between the two of them. And we're going to talk about pore size on our purifications first. So we're going to begin by discussing how pore size affects the separation for both small molecules and for peptides, larger molecules. So what we see is that as we increase the pore size of our silica, this is a C18 silica, we see reduced retention. And this is because we see reduced surface area, and so there's reduced interaction with the stationary phase. So if we're reducing the interaction with the stationary phase, you're going to result in reduced retention. As you can see here, as we move from 120 angstrom to 300 angstrom particle size. So now we're going to look at larger molecules. So we're going to look at a series of peptides here, EGFR7, thymosin, and AS48. They have variable molecular weights ranging from 1,600 grams per mole to almost 8,000 grams per mole. And the smaller peptide here, we'll look at its retention compared on a 120 angstrom pore, 200 angstrom pore, and 300 angstrom pore stationary phase. And we'll see here that the retention decreases from 4.2 to 4.1 minutes. So it's slightly less retained as we increase the pore size so that we have actually less interaction. It behaves like a small molecule. When we look at thymosin, however, we begin to see an opposite behavior. And then the retention times actually increased as we increase the pore size. This is even further evident when we look at the AS48, which has a molecular weight closer to 8,000. It starts to, retention begins to increase as well. So what does this mean? So we're going to look at the effective pore size. And if we look at large molecules, they just don't fit into the small pores as you look in the illustration on the left. So we can see that small molecules are able to enter the pore and interact strongly, whether it's 100 angstrom, 200 angstrom, or 300 angstrom pore size. But the larger the molecule, the less accessible it is to the pore for the peptide. And this reduces the effective surface area. Larger peptides are able to fit into the larger pores, and that increases the effective surface area. So this leads to better retention. So we need to look at two balancing factors here. One is the surface area of the particle, which actually decreases as we increase pore size. But then we also have to look at the accessibility. And what we find is that the accessible pore size for larger molecules, larger peptides, requires a larger pore size. And the 200 angstrom pore is really a sweet spot for peptides as it balances the decreasing surface area by having a larger pore size, but it also increases the accessible surface area for the molecule because it can accommodate the larger molecule. Next, we'll look at C8 and C18 and the effective chain length on the purification. So in this case, we'll look at our small molecule again. This is a mixture of parabens, and we'll see that the small molecules have reduced retention as we decrease the chain length. And the reason for this is because we're getting less interaction between the functionalized C18 and these parabens and these groups. So we're getting less retention, less interaction, less retention. So again, we'll look at our peptides to model how larger molecules may interact differently with the C18, the C8, and the C4. And we'll see we don't see much of a difference for the smaller EGFR7 and the thymosin here. There's not really a big change from the change in our chain length. So as we begin to move from thymosin and AS48, we start to see an increase in retention as we decrease the chain length here. And so how do we explain this effect? And so we're going to look at a diagram of the pore size of a 100 angstrom bare silica particle. And it's highlighted in red here. So we have 100 angstrom basically opening here. As we functionalize the silica from the surface, at the surface with either C8 or C18 media or functionalization, we actually reduce the effective pore size. And so in this example here for C18, it reduces the pore size to about 55 angstrom. This is the smallest pore after we've bonded the alkyl phase to the silica, and essentially it partially closes. So as the pore size will increase as the chain length decreases. And so as they open up, you increase as pores are more open, the effective surface area is increased for larger molecules. The C18 opening is also larger than the C18, but not quite as wide as the C18 pore. And so even when we have similar silica pore sizes, the C18 bonded phase columns are more accessible to large columns. So if we were to compare that to a 300 angstrom C18 versus the C8 bonded 200 angstrom particle, this is a better choice and it's accessible to large molecule. Another thing that's going on is that there's actually a change in retention compared to small molecules because of a change in the behavior. And so what happens is that peptides tend to just lie across the ends of the alkyl change. So as we have C18, if we were to have C18 on there, the peptide's basically not able to go in between the changes, lying on top and interacting on top. Small molecules are able to have some underlying interaction with the silica. And so these polar silanol interactions can increase the retention. You can kind of see how molecules can go inside the chains and orient differently than larger peptides and other molecules. So we get increased retention that way because of increased interaction with the silanol surface. So how do we choose between C18, C18AQ, or C8 columns for peptides and larger molecules? So we can really think of it in two ways. We can look at the molecular weight, and we can also look at the hydrophobicity. And so with the hydrophobicity, if we have decreased hydrophobicity, we're going to want increased interaction with the silanol surface. And that's where the C18AQ column can come in and really do well with these smaller molecules below 1,000 Dalton and with decreased hydrophobicity. So we're going to be working in the lower organic percent or even highly aqueous environments. You know, the RediSep C18 also works really well in this molecular weight range from 1 to 1,000 or 2,000, especially with increasing hydrophobicity. So you get the C18 interaction with those more hydrophobic peptides or molecules. And then we have our 200 angstrom C8 media, and this offers a very wide range of for purifications, anywhere from molecular weight near 100 to up to 15,000 Dalton, and across the hydrophobicity range because of your effective pore size and the interaction that you can have with your larger molecules and the stationary phase. So next, outside the applications with larger molecules and peptides and choosing between C18 and C18AQ, we're going to talk about some other unique applications for these columns that are outside just traditional larger molecules and small molecule purifications. So we'll begin this section with some unique applications of the RediSep Gold C18AQ flash column. And the C18AQ flash column offers a unique alternative to our C18 media, particularly under highly polar aqueous conditions. And the reason for this is that traditional C18 columns are designed to reduce interaction with the silanol surface by end capping with a non-polar group. What happens though under highly polar aqueous conditions is that the C18 molecules begin to phase collapse and they interact with each other, basically decreasing the decreasing access to the silanol surface as it's basically blocking it from the highly polar aqueous mobile phase. C18AQ addresses this problem by end capping with hydrophilic groups. This reduces the tendency for C18 to collapse, allowing for better retention. And you'll look on the right here in the diagram is that the C18 molecules are able to basically remain extended, and there's access to the silanol surface for interaction with our compounds of interest. So we get increased reaction between polar compounds and the stationary phase. This increases our retention. And this is really useful for highly polar compounds like peptides, oligos, and high aqueous purification environments. The other really nice thing about this is offers a different selectivity than the C18. So sometimes you will have a purification on C18 and we just don't see a selectivity difference. Changing to C18AQ can offer a selectivity change for you to take advantage of. So here's an example of purification of some dyes. This is application note 76. And what we see here is that we have a comparison between runs performed on the gold C18 and the RediSep gold C18AQ on the left. And what we see is that the the tetrazine compound 1 is a little bit better retained on the C18AQ. So basically you're seeing a selectivity difference, more retention essentially for these compounds. Another example here is that we're able to increase the loading on the right using the C18AQ because we're getting better retention and interaction at the stationary phase by switching to the C18AQ. So that retention and selectivity allows us to load up to 3 times more sample in the case on the right here. Another really unique application for the C18AQ column is you can actually use it as a desalting column. And this is great for samples that require desalting, as they're generally very dilute and there's a large volume of water that causes phase clash with other types of C18. And so this is from application note 95. And so some of the things you need to ensure, this is really good after you've done a ion exchange and your compound's maybe in buffer and needs to be desalted. You want to ensure that you've removed any organic solvent from the sample before you load it on there. Additionally, you want to precondition the column with 5 CVs of methanol or acetonitrile, followed by 5 CVs of water. So we're going to load this at 0% organic solvent, 100% water, and then we're going to do a jump to 100% organic. So basically what we're doing is eluting the salt off the column while the compound is well retained. And then once we go to 100% organic, the compound will then elute off without any of the salt behind. And so you can load up to 5% of your compound if you're desalting, but if you're also doing a purification, maybe there's an impurity you're also eluting out as part of this desalting process, you'd only want to load up to 1%. This could be an example where your dilute sample loading volume could be a lot larger than your column volume without breaking through because it's so well retained with the C18AQ. And the nice thing is this also removes most of the water, so you're able to dry your compound, evaporate your solvent off faster. Another application here is from application note 97. So this is really neat, especially when you dissolve your sample maybe in deuterated DMSO or something like that, or you need to remove a non-volatile solvent. Maybe it's DMF or DMSO or something like that. And what we can do is you can dilute your sample with water and basically kind of do the same process. So we're going to go ahead and load, precondition the column and then follow it with 100% water. And then we're going to load up to 5% of our compound there once we've diluted it. And so basically what happens is our compound again interacts very strongly with the C18AQ stationary phase. So it's staying on the column. Your strong solvent, your DMSO, is getting diluted with water significantly, and you're going to see the DMSO essentially elute out ahead of the compound. And so this is really good, again, because the C18 media, you're not able to do this with because of the phase collapse. So another way that we can use C18 columns and or C18 AQ or C8 or amine columns is that we can use them in a non-aqueous reverse phase manner. And so here's an example of a purification of C60 fullerene from other fullerene derivatives. And this is found in application note 92. So essentially what non-aqueous reverse phase means is that we're going to replace the water, our A solvent, which is traditionally our more polar solvent, right, with the alcohol. And then we're going to replace our B solvent with a solvent that is less polar than alcohol, like acetone, DCM, toluene, hexane. We just need to be aware of any miscibility issues with our A solvent. And so in the example here, this is a really good tool for the purification of non-polar compounds that are difficult to solubilize in aqueous reverse phase and that are not well retained on a polar silica stationary phase. So you'll see on the example, when this was performed on bare silica, there was no retention, there wasn't a good separation there. However, when we do this purification on C18, even though the chromatogram doesn't look great, but we're able to get pure compounds in about from from the 3 to 11 CV region of the C60 fullerene, and we see its characteristic purple color. So in this example, this was a gradient ran from 0 to 30% toluene in IPA. And so here's another example of the C18 non-aqueous reverse phase. This is from application note 58 and from a poster here. But on the sample on the left is a lycopene. And what we can see is that by running this gradient in 0 to 100% DCM methanol, where methanol is our more polar solvent and DCM is our less polar solvent, we're able to get really good separation of some of these different compounds from the plant extract and able to get our lycopene, pure lycopene derivative. Below, though, is another example, and this compares the C18 non-aqueous reverse phase to normal phase runs on silica, the amine column, or cyano and diol functionalized columns. And what we see here is that with the normal phase separations, we don't get good retention or interaction with the acyl glycerates from the fish oil using a hexane acetone gradient. But when we move to a methanol acetone gradient, we're actually able to, on C18, we're able to see retention and separation between the impurities from the fish oil. Additionally, ELSD would be a great tool for this. We talked about the UV baseline correction, which we'll talk about later, but ELSD would be a great tool here for lipids as well. And finally, just since we're talking about solvent strength for non-aqueous reverse phase, you can see here the solvent chart. So you can see the solvent strength. So if we're using methanol, you would need to use a solvent with less strength when we're doing non-aqueous reverse phase. So methanol, you could use methanol THF, methanol DCM, methanol ether, methanol toluene, and then same thing with ethanol and hexane, or 2-IPA and hexane as well. Next, we're going to talk about some specific examples of where we should use our amine column. So we're going to be talking about basic compounds particularly, so compounds that have amines, had nitrogen heterocycles, things like that. And so our amine flash columns are well documented in application note 31. So this is a really good example of how we can make several changes in our purification workflow that are beneficial on a few different levels. So one, we see our TLC plates on the left here. So we have our TLC with our heterocyclic mixture of nicotine, 1-methylbenzimidazole, and then a mixture of the two. And so when we do this on silica with no modifier, essentially we get it to streak down the TLC plate. And this is a common experience that you guys see in the lab when you're working with amines. And so a lot of times what we'll do is we'll want to deactivate the silica by adding ammonium hydroxide or triethylamine to help reduce the tailing as that competes with the silica and the silanol interaction with the amine and the bare silica. And so on the medium, you can see reduced tailing and you get separation, and then the triethylamine definitely improves the tailing significantly. But we're still using that methanol dichloromethane gradient. If we translate this to our flash chromatography, we can see the chromatogram here doing a normal phase separation on silica with hexane ethyl acetate. We don't get any separation of our heterocycles. They're very strongly retained on the on the silica. They don't come out till late, and we have a mixture of compounds A and B. However, if we use our amine functionalized column with that same solvent system, now we see very clear resolution between A and B, and we can go ahead and increase our loading, and we get really good purification with our amine column. And so our amine column is obviously reusable as well, so this is an advantage for us. And this avoided the use of using dichloromethane in the separation as well. Here is another example, and so in this case we're using DCM methanol gradient. In the amine functionalized stationary phase essentially allowed us to increase the loading compared to using it on silica. So on bare silica, we were only able to use 1% load 1% of the compound on it. However, when we did the purification with 1% load on the amine column, we had very good resolution. And with that resolution, what we can do is we can take advantage of it and increase our loading capacity. So we were able to load up to 10%, 10 times as much on the amine column versus the silica column using the same the same mobile phase conditions. One other thing I'll point out is that you can actually use the amine columns as reverse phase as well. And you can also use them as a weak anion exchange column. So if you look at application note 99, I won't go into the details, but you can use it as a weak anion exchange column. And then you could go ahead and desalt that with a C18AQ column afterwards. So another really great tool for basic compounds is our alumina selection. And so these are offered in a basic and neutral version. And the neutral example is shown below. And these are really great for acid-sensitive compounds. And they help to minimize streaking of the compounds that may have an acidic or basic moiety. This is a really good alternative to silica. Some things to note about alumina, though, is that it is more polar than silica. So it's actually going to have a stronger retention for polar compounds, potentially. Water can greatly affect the activity of the alumina. So as we increase the water content, it's going to decrease the activity of alumina. So it's really important that you get a consistent source for your alumina, like we do with our RediSep alumina column, so that you get consistent performance from lot to lot. The other thing that you can note is that the elution order can actually change as you move from basic to neutral alumina. So here's just an example. This is a silica purification, hexane ethyl acetate on the left, and the same purification performed on alumina on the right. You can see we don't get any separation here between the two nitrogen heterocycles on silica. We get kind of broad peaks and maybe not even elution until late, just well retained on the silica. So when we do the separation on alumina on the right, we can see we get clear baseline resolution between compounds A and B. Another example of the alumina is the basic example using the alumina basic media. And this is for a more basic heterocycle. You can see on silica, you didn't really get good separation between the compounds. However, when you do this purification, and it's coming out at 100%, 100% solvent also. When we do this purification on alumina, we can actually get some resolution and get sufficient purity between our peaks between A and B here. So finally, what we're going to end with is our some tools on the CombiFlash NextGen series that allow us to use different mobile phases, and it helps expand some of the stationary phases and tools that we can use as well, because we have different mobile phase systems we can use. So the big feature here is the expanded collection options of using baseline correction. And so what essentially this does is the NextGen is going to enable a pre-run gradient to measure the baseline absorbance of your solvent system. And this allows the system to essentially subtract the baseline from your run. And this expands our detection ability across all wavelengths and not limited by solvent UV cutoff. This opens up other solvent alternatives not traditionally used in chromatography. So you could use greener solvent alternatives. We could use different solvent systems. We could use non-aqueous reverse phase using toluene and acetone as solvents. On silica, you can use acetone, ethyl acetate as well below its UV cutoff and still have detection of your compounds. And so this is nice because it also allows us to open up the selectivity of our toolboxes, combining that with our stationary phase to give us more options for efficient purifications. And so just to highlight how to use this can be found in the method editor here. And if you click on details next to your peak of interest or your peak detection that you've set up, hit details, and then just choose baseline correction. So here's some examples of the baseline correction with it on and with it off. And so this is ethyl acetate at 215 nanometers. You can see at 254, we can see it fine in the red. But the 214 signal in the purple is obviously saturated with the ethyl acetate signal. When we use this with baseline correction, we actually get really, we're able to eliminate that increasing absorbance from the contributed from the ethyl acetate without, sacrificing the dynamic range that we see for our compound in ethyl acetate. So this is a really good tool. This is just a really good illustration of how you can take advantage of it. Another way is with acetone as a solvent. And so we can look at acetone on the bottom here. You can see the drifting baseline. And at the end of the separation, you may not be able to see your compound eluting. But if we do this with baseline correction here with this compound, you see it's well resolved. And then you don't get the baseline drift at the end as well. So at this time, that concludes the talk. I do want to thank you guys for your time. Feel free to reach out to me at joshua.lovell@teledyne.com with any questions. You can also link to us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube using the QR codes below. So we ask that you follow us, and on YouTube there specifically, we'll get recordings of the webinars. And at this time, we'll go ahead and open up to questions from the floor.
Okay, guys, we have a couple questions already in the QA section here. If you guys have any additional ones, feel free to go ahead and use the QA function in Zoom and go ahead and add those, and we'll try and get them answered here today. So I'll start here. We have a customer here that is doing work with functionalized nucleosides that are highly polar. And they have retention issues on their reverse phase columns with them. So they're interested in the Hillock method, and I think this might be a promising alternative for them. So with the Hillock columns, if we're using the bare silica, we do need to be aware that there is a solubility of silica as we put it under basic condition. So as long as we're pH 8 and below, so neutral or acidic conditions, we can go ahead and use however much water that we need to elute that compound down the column. The other thing to keep in mind as well is that you can use the other question. Part of that question was whether to use irregular silica or gold silica. And the gold silica would offer an advantage because it has increased loading capacity. So you're going to get better interaction there between your compound, more surface area and such. So you're getting a better interaction and retention for your purification. So it would be advisable to go ahead and use the gold media for that as well. Additionally, there's less fines in it as well. So as you increase the amount of water in there, that might be a problem with irregular particle shape as well. That would contribute to maybe some back pressure and things like that. So I would suggest the gold media. The other option is to stick to reverse phase and maybe try a modified C18 like the C18AQ that we offer. So keep in mind that allows us to go down to 0% organic content in the reverse phase separation, so we can start at 0% water. And it also has more interaction with the silanol surface as it doesn't undergo phase collapse. So there's less C18 molecules on there, a little bit more exposed silanol surface. And that would allow your compounds to have a better interaction with the stationary phase as well. So you may get retention with that column when you wouldn't get those with other medias. Another question related to the Hillock columns is how do you do your loading for them? So you can use the solid load cartridge. You could load it onto silica with a strong solvent and evaporate that down. You could also load it, do liquid loading with your weak solvent. So You know, traditionally, whenever you're working with a solvent system, you can really define what your weak solvent is by what your starting composition is, and then your strong solvent, what you're alluding to. And so just in general for loading, if you're doing liquid loading, so loading in conditions that are most similar to your starting conditions are going to give you the best loading conditions. You should have good retention on the silica too, as well under these conditions versus other separations. We got that one there. Let's see, you got a couple others here. Just one sec. Let me get the screen correct. So another question here is regarding the purification of plant alkaloids. They have higher pKa values, you know, around 9 and 10. And so when they run on silica gel, they don't have good separation. They get a lot of streaking. And so the amine column would be a very good choice for these kinds of compounds. And you wouldn't have to add modifier. You're going to get better retention or better interaction with the stationary phase. So you're going to get better peak shape as well. So this is a really good choice. The other, you know, potentially would be like a basic alumina as well. But I think the amine column really gives you, you know, it's reusable. You know, gives a really good, nice separation there for these kinds of compounds. So, you know, reach out if you have additional questions regarding that. Another question here. Oh, a good question here about the reusability column. So why are the alternate media phases reusable while the silica columns aren't? And the reason for this is because of the solvent systems that you're using. And so what happens with silica under normal phase conditions, with traditional normal phase solvents like hexane and DCM, is you get swelling of the column body over time. And so these are good for one, maybe two uses, and then you get column body swelling, and that causes channeling in the column essentially, or channeling, and you don't get, you know, your separation channels down. You don't get separation with the silica. So what we don't have a problem with in the reverse phase systems for this. Now, when you're using the amine column with normal phase solvents, this is something you do need to be aware of. And so what you'd want to do is then make sure you're following the storage conditions and flushing it with a solvent like IPA that is miscible with the normal phase solvents, and storing it under IPA conditions so that you don't get that column body swelling. So it's really important to follow those care guidelines, and specific ones are included with the columns if you purchase them. Another question here regarding loading on the C18AQ column is, so how can we load onto that column? And so we're actually going to be releasing a new technical note describing how to do this. And so there's a couple different ways. You can actually, you know, absorb your compound onto silica, and then, you know, elute that down. So you can actually use silica as a loading material for your separation. Additionally, you could use C-Lite as well. C-Lite's going to be a little less retentive, or a lot less retentive than the silica. And you know, that's another option. The other thing is you can use C18. Keep in mind, if you're using loose C18, you should probably precondition that. The reason being, the same reason we precondition our columns, is that C18 isn't fully extended and exposed until it's been preconditioned. And so it's not really going to interact very well with your compound of interest, so there's not going to be any retention. So anytime you add like a media like that that's similar, essentially you're just kind of elongating the length of your column and creating a little longer separation. And you wouldn't, you know, you should precondition that C18. Now, the next question is that a problem with starting at 0% organic solvent? So potentially it would be, because it'd be the kind of the same situation with the preconditioning. So I would suggest using a C-Lite material for reverse phase, or you could also use silica. And like I said, we'll be posting that new application note later this month. But feel free to reach out and we can get those details to you. Another really good question here is, could you use the amine column in a helic fashion? And you definitely could. The one, you know, you can use any stationary phase in a helic mode. The idea there is that it's, you know, you're going from organic solvent to increased water content. So it's it's opposite of the reverse phase. So it's really just kind of an extended mobile or normal phase separation. So that's something you could do. You could use different stationary phases, and you see a lot of different analytical columns that are they say are Hillock columns, and they're modified with functional groups, but in reality, it's the same as their reverse phase. It's just now that there's some water content on that functionalization. So now you can use that in a Hillock way. It's just a different way of using it. It's not as common. And we got one last question, or two last questions, okay, here. And let me just read through it quick here. So this is a really good question regarding using C18 columns in non-aqueous reverse phase systems, and potentially damaging them depending on the polarity of the solvent that you're using. And so this is a good question. This is going to be dependent on what column stationary phases you're using. With our C18, you could go ahead and you could use normal phase solvents without having to worry about damaging your column. There are some stationary phases that you can't do that. Chiral columns are known for, this is a different separation, but they have solvent restrictions on what you can use on them because you may damage the column. So that's something you do want to be aware of. Follow your manufacturer's guidelines, and you can, on our C18 and C18AQ, you can go to a hexane, fully to a or a hexane-like solvent, essentially, with non-aqueous reverse phase. You just need to be concerned about the miscibility there. Last question there is if a separation is observed on TLC, but on the during the purification they elute together because there's solubility issues. What can you do? And so this is a really good question. Is you're right. Sometimes we're going to get separations on TLC that look great. We have great resolution, but the problem is that solubility and loading our compound is a big deal, right? And it's a big contributor to whether or not we get band broadening initially, and band broadening, and then potential non-baseline resolution of our peaks. So what can we do? Just general loading guidelines, and we've talked about this in previous webinars, but loading in the weakest solvent possible is always a good method. And then the other tool that's available on our systems is using the solid load cartridges, right? Using the solid load cartridge basically eliminates the solvent effect. So there's a couple different ways you can do this. If you're doing this on C18, it's good to precondition that C18 so that you're actually getting some retention there. You can precondition it the same as you equilibrate it, get your sample on there, and then actually push it through. So there's the technical note that we'll be putting out later this month would be of value, and we can reach out to you with that information as well. But very good question there. So. With that, I don't see any other questions. I want to appreciate you guys for your thank you guys for your time today. Appreciate you guys' attention and good questions, and look forward to seeing you guys again soon. So thank you.